The light in the Santa Clara Valley has a particular quality just before dawn. It is not yet light, but a suggestion of it, a slow dilution of the blackness into a deep, bruised purple. It is in this moment of profound quiet, when the air is still cool and tastes of dust and distant orchards, that the house is most itself. From a distance, its silhouette is an aberration, a jagged cardiogram scribbled against the softening sky. It is a Victorian mansion, but one that has forgotten the rules of being a house. Gables sprout from other gables, turrets rise like watchtowers guarding nothing, and windows stare out from walls where no rooms should be. There is no symmetry, no grand entrance that declares a singular purpose. Instead, it is a collection of architectural impulses, a frantic, decades-long conversation with an unseen audience. This is the Winchester House, a name that carries the cold, metallic weight of history. It was built with a fortune earned from a rifle, a tool of expansion and extermination that carved a nation out of wilderness and men out of life. And the structure it paid for feels less like a home and more like a penance. It stands in the quiet of the morning, not as a monument to wealth, but as an argument against it. It is an enormous, sprawling 160-room made of redwood and glass. The paradox is immediate and suffocating. A thing of immense material substance, built to appease the insubstantial. You can walk its perimeter for what feels like a mile, tracing the incoherent logic of its design, and feel the weight of its central contradiction. It is a fortress built not to keep intruders out, but to placate the ones already inside. What kind of fear requires a blueprint that changes daily? What guilt is so profound that it can only be quieted by the sound of a hammer, a sound that echoed here without pause for 38 years? The house keeps its own counsel. Its walls, layered with lath and plaster and a century of silence, refuse to speak. But the design screams. It screams of a mind trying to map the geography of its own terror, to build a physical labyrinth that might confuse the ghosts of memory. It is beautiful, yes, but that is just the facade, the first and most convincing lie. The beauty is in the details, the Tiffany art glass, the hand-inlaid parquet floors. The horror is in the intent. This was not a house built for living. It was a house built for hiding. It was a trap, designed by the very person it was meant to capture. And as the first real light of day catches the highest, most useless spire, one must ask, what prayer or what apology is being offered here in this cathedral of regret? The sheer scale of the place defies easy comprehension. To speak of its statistics is to recite a litany of obsession. 160 rooms, though the number is forever in dispute, as if the house itself resists being quantified. 40 bedrooms, for a woman who almost always slept in a different one each night. 13 bathrooms, a number repeated with talismanic insistence throughout the structure, from the number of panes in a window to the number of steps in a flight of stairs. 6 kitchens, as if preparing for an army of guests who would never be invited. 47 fireplaces, many of them leading nowhere, their chimneys stopping abruptly in the ceiling, built to offer a warmth that could never be felt. 2,000 doors, some opening onto solid walls, others onto sheer 3-story drops to the ground below, booby traps for the uninitiated, or perhaps for the spectral. 10,000 windows, more glass than in any private home in the country at the time, portals for light to enter rooms that were then boarded up, sanctuaries of brightness designed only to be plunged into permanent darkness. And the staircases. The staircases are the most articulate expression of the house's madness. One ascends 7 steps, turns, and descends 11, ending up precisely where it began. Another, the infamous switchback staircase, rises 9 feet with 44 steps, each riser a mere 2 inches high, a bewildering and exhausting journey to the next floor. And most famously, a staircase that climbs directly into the ceiling, a path to the undiscovered country, a cruel joke on the laws of physics. This is not architecture. It is a form of psychological warfare waged against the principles of reason. It is a floor plan dictated by nightmare logic. The layout is a deliberate rejection of order, a maze intended to disorient. Hallways twist and narrow into nothing. A cabinet door opens to reveal not shelves, but a passage into another 30 rooms. The upstairs and downstairs dynamic is not merely one of master and servant, but of a building at war with itself, its floors disconnected, its levels refusing to align. One can imagine the legion of carpenters, their faces etched with confusion, receiving their daily orders from a veiled widow who communicated through an intermediary. Build a room here. No, tear it down. Add a tower. Now enclose it within another wing. The work was constant, the purpose opaque. They were not constructing a home. They were participating in a ritual. They were the high priests of a strange religion, their hammers and saws the instruments of a perpetual ceremony. Their job was not to understand, but to build. The result is a structure that feels alive, a cancerous growth of wood and nails that expanded outwards and upwards without a coherent plan, feeding on an inexhaustible supply of money and a bottomless well of fear. It is the world's most expensive and elaborate compulsive thought, a physical manifestation of a mind that could not stop moving, terrified of what might catch it if it ever stood still. The story of this house is the story of Sarah Lockwood Pardee Winchester. To understand the blueprint of her fear, one must first understand the architecture of her grief. She was born into East Coast society, a woman of refinement, intelligence, and privilege. She was a musician, fluent in multiple languages, known as the Belle of New Haven. She married William Wirt Winchester, the heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a union of social and financial equals. Their future seemed assured, a comfortable and predictable passage through the upper echelons of Gilded Age America. But the universe, or perhaps the ghosts of the future, had other plans. The first crack in the foundation of her life was the death of her only child, Annie Pardee Winchester, just a few weeks after her birth in 1866. The loss was absolute, a void that no amount of wealth or status could fill. It unmoored her, casting her into a state of profound and permanent melancholy. The second blow came 15 years later, in 1881, when her husband William succumbed to tuberculosis. In the space of a decade and a half, Sarah had lost everyone she was meant to build a life with. She was left a widow, childless, and burdened with an almost unimaginable inheritance. She controlled 50% of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company stock, a sum of $20 million, and a daily income of $1,000. In today's currency, she inherited the equivalent of over $500 million, with a daily stipend that would equate to nearly $30,000. It was a fortune soaked in blood. The Winchester rifle, model 1873, was not just a product. It was a legend. It was called the gun that won the West. It was the tool of choice for settlers, soldiers, and cowboys, a brutally efficient instrument of manifest destiny. It had killed thousands. Native Americans defending their land, soldiers in faraway conflicts, ranchers in disputes over grazing rights, outlaws and lawmen alike. Every bullet fired from a Winchester rifle was an entry in a vast and bloody ledger. And now Sarah was the bookkeeper. The money that filled her accounts was a direct product of this violence. Every dollar was stained. She was the queen of a kingdom of death, the beneficiary of a technology of slaughter. This was the source of the inheritance, and it would become the source of the haunting. The weight of this legacy, combined with the crushing void of her personal losses, created a perfect storm of guilt, grief, and terror. Her fortune was not a comfort. It was a curse. Her name was not a source of pride. It was a brand associated with mechanized death. She had the financial means to do anything in the world, yet she was spiritually bankrupt, a prisoner of her own name. It was in this state of desperate vulnerability that she sought an answer, any answer, that could explain the cruelty of her fate and offer a path, however strange, to salvation. It was a friend, desperate to pull Sarah from the depths of her despair, who suggested she consult a spiritualist. In the late 19th century, this was not as outlandish as it sounds today. Spiritualism was a powerful social and religious movement, a comfort to a generation ravaged by the Civil War, offering what seemed like tangible proof that the dead were not truly gone. Sarah, a woman of intellect and reason, was now adrift in a sea of grief so vast that reason offered no anchor. She traveled to Boston to meet with Adam Koontz, a well-known medium who claimed to be able to channel the spirits of the deceased. The meeting took place in a darkened room, filled with the requisite theatricality of the Victorian seance. What was said in that room would alter the course of Sarah's life and change the landscape of a California valley forever. According to the legend, the medium did not channel her beloved husband, William. Instead, he claimed to be a conduit for William's spirit, who spoke through him with a chilling message. He told her that her family was cursed. The tragedies that had befallen her, the death of her child and her husband, were not random acts of fate. They were retribution. The spirits of the countless people killed by the Winchester rifle, he explained, were angry. They were restless, and they were haunting the Winchester family line. The vast fortune she had inherited was not a blessing but a chain, binding her to every soul dispatched by her family's invention. The ghosts, William's spirit supposedly warned, had taken him and their daughter, and now they were coming for her. Her life was in peril, but he offered a sliver of hope, a bizarre and demanding path to redemption. She was to leave her home in New Haven and travel west, towards the setting sun. There she was to build a great house, not for herself but for the spirits. It was to be a sanctuary for the souls of the dead, a place for them to find peace. And, in the most crucial and fateful instruction of all, she was told that the construction must never ever stop. As long as the sound of hammers echoed, as long as the house was growing, her life would be spared. The moment the building ceased, she would die. We can only imagine what this message did to a mind already fractured by grief and guilt. Was it a genuine spiritual communication? Or was the medium a canny charlatan, telling a wealthy, vulnerable widow exactly what her tormented soul was primed to hear? It doesn't matter. For Sarah, the message was gospel. It gave her a reason for her suffering. It was not meaningless. It was a curse. And a curse, unlike meaningless tragedy, can be managed, can be fought. The prescription was mad, but it was a prescription nonetheless. It offered her a purpose. Her life was no longer about mourning what she had lost. It was about building to protect what she had left. The project was a penance, an architectural apology on a colossal scale. She was to take the blood money, the profits of death, and transform it into a haven for the dead. It was a way to launder her fortune, to appease the ghosts of her family's legacy. One plank, one nail, one bewildering room at a time. Following the medium's instructions with the conviction of a true believer, Sarah Winchester turned her back on the East Coast society that had defined her entire life. She liquidated her assets in New Haven, packed her belongings, and journeyed west in 1884, a pilgrim on a holy, if terrifying, mission. Her destination was the Santa Clara Valley in California, then a bucolic landscape of orchards and open space, known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. The climate was mild, a stark contrast to the harsh winters of Connecticut, and perhaps she believed the abundant sunshine could chase away some of the shadows that plagued her. She found what she was looking for in a modest, unfinished 8-room farmhouse sitting on 45 acres of land. To any normal person, it was a simple country home with potential. To Sarah Winchester, it was ground zero for the most ambitious and bizarre construction project in American history. It was here she would build her bastion against the spirit world. It was here she would begin the work that would consume the rest of her life and the entirety of her vast fortune. The initial phase was not one of frantic, chaotic expansion. It was a period of settling in, of laying the groundwork for her grand, appeasing gesture. She hired local carpenters and craftsmen, establishing a small but dedicated crew. At first, the work seemed logical. She was completing the existing farmhouse, adding rooms for herself and for her niece, Marion Marriott, who had come to live with her as a companion and a link to the world of the living. But soon, the nature of the work began to change. The additions became more frequent, the plans more fluid. Rooms were built only to be torn down or altered weeks later. A new wing would be commissioned, its purpose unclear to anyone but Sarah herself. The simple farmhouse began to metastasize. It grew appendages, sprouted towers, and spread across the landscape like an invasive vine. The machine of perpetual construction had been switched on, and it would not be switched off for nearly 4 decades. What must it have been like for Sarah in those early years? Was there a sense of hope, a belief that this monumental act of contrition would actually work? Did she find a strange comfort in the daily routine of creation, in the scent of sawdust and the rhythmic percussion of the hammers? The house was not yet the sprawling labyrinth it would become. In those initial stages, it was perhaps still a sanctuary, a place where she could actively bargain with her fate. Every new room was a prayer. Every added hallway was a plea for forgiveness. She was not just building with redwood and nails. She was building with her fear. The project gave her a sense of control in a life that had been defined by its brutal lack of it. She could not bring back her daughter or her husband, but she could build a wall, however strange and illogical, between herself and the forces that had taken them. She was taking the abstract terror that haunted her mind and giving it a physical form, a tangible enemy that she could fight with blueprints and construction crews. The house became her obsession because it was her only hope. It was an elaborate, exhausting, and incredibly expensive coping mechanism, a way for a woman drowning in grief to keep her head above water by constantly, frantically, building a life raft. The work was relentless, a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation. The sound of construction became the defining feature of the property, a constant, churning engine of creation and demolition. It was the house's heartbeat, a mechanical pulse that assured its owner she was still alive. A day crew of 16 carpenters would work from sunrise to sunset. As they packed their tools, a night crew would arrive, their work illuminated by gaslight, to continue the ceaseless expansion. This was not a project with a deadline. The deadline was death itself. The foreman, John Hanson, was one of the few people who had direct, albeit limited, contact with Mrs. Winchester. Each morning, he would be summoned to a meeting where she would present him with the day's plans. These were not professional blueprints drawn by an architect. They were sketches, often scrawled on napkins or scraps of paper, diagrams of the visions that had come to her in the night. The stories say she would enter her private seance room, the Blue Room, at midnight, ringing a bell to summon the spirits. She would commune with them, seeking guidance on the house's design. The spirits, she believed, told her what to build to appease them and where to build to confuse the malevolent ones. This mystical process resulted in the architectural chaos that defines the house. A new wing might be ordered to block a ghost's path. A hallway might be made intentionally narrow and winding to trap a spirit. A door might be installed in a second-floor wall leading to nowhere, a trap for any entity that might be following her. The carpenters, practical men of wood and steel, were tasked with translating these supernatural instructions into physical reality. What they must have thought is lost to history. They were well paid, their employment secure as long as the widow's fear and fortune held out. For them, it was a job, perhaps the strangest job in all of California. They built staircases that led to ceilings and were paid the same as for staircases that led to the next floor. They installed exquisite Tiffany stained glass windows and were then ordered to board them over. They were the anonymous soldiers in Sarah Winchester's private war, their labor the ammunition. They were the invisible army, the hands that gave shape to her paranoia. The dynamic was one of extreme separation. Sarah lived in a self-imposed isolation, a veiled queen in her ever-expanding castle. She rarely ventured out and few were invited in. Her presence was felt not through personal interaction, but through the daily, baffling instructions and the steady flow of money from her accounts. The house was her entire world, and she was its ghost long before she died. The construction was a shield, not just from the spirits of the dead, but from the world of the living. The constant noise, the endless activity, the ever-shifting landscape of her own home. It was all a buffer, a complex system designed to keep reality, with all its painful memories and demands, at a comfortable distance. The trap was being built, and while it was intended for the ghosts, its true prisoner was the architect herself. The internal logic of the Winchester Mystery House is a study in applied superstition. While it appears to be a chaotic jumble of rooms from the outside, for Sarah, it was a highly organized defense system, a fortress built according to the arcane rules of the spirit world. The most dominant motif, the key to the entire design philosophy, is the number 13. It is woven into the fabric of the building like a recurring incantation. There are windows with 13 panes of glass, walls with 13 panels. The grand ballroom has 13 chandeliers. The greenhouse has 13 cupolas. The main staircase has 13 steps. Even the sink drains in the kitchens have 13 holes. This was no coincidence. For Sarah, the number was not a symbol of bad luck, but a powerful talisman. By embracing it, by plastering it across her home, she was attempting to harness its supernatural power, to turn a symbol of dread into a shield of protection. It was an act of architectural jujitsu, using the enemy's own energy against it. Another recurring design is the spiderweb, a pattern she found deeply symbolic. A custom-made Tiffany window, allegedly designed by Sarah herself, features a delicate spiderweb pattern in its leaded glass. This motif is repeated in other details throughout the house. For her, the web was not a symbol of being trapped, but of trapping others. It was a net to catch the malevolent spirits that pursued her. The house itself was conceived as a giant, three-dimensional web, its confusing corridors and dead ends designed to ensnare and hold the angry ghosts, preventing them from ever reaching her. The heart of this spiritual operation was the Blue Room, or the Seance Room, located deep within the mansion's core. This was Sarah's private sanctum, the one room where, according to legend, she would go each night to seek guidance. It is a simple, small chamber with 3 entrances but only one exit. One door has a secret spring lock on the outside, suggesting she could be locked in. Another entrance is a small panel, requiring one to crawl through to enter. It was here, surrounded by darkness and silence broken only by the distant sound of hammers, that she supposedly communed with the good spirits, who would give her the architectural instructions for the coming day. These consultations were the source of the house's most bewildering features. If a spirit warned her of a presence in the West Wing, she would order that section to be torn down or sealed off. If they advised a path of confusion, a winding, nonsensical hallway would be constructed. The house was a living blueprint, redrawn nightly based on the intelligence gathered from another plane of existence. We can analyze this from a modern psychological perspective and see a woman externalizing her internal turmoil. The spirits were manifestations of her own anxiety and guilt. The act of building was a ritual to manage these overwhelming feelings. The spiderwebs and the number 13 were obsessive-compulsive behaviors given architectural form. The seance room was a place for deep, and perhaps tormented, meditation. But for Sarah Winchester, this was all terrifyingly real. She was not engaging in a symbolic act. She was fighting for her life. The house was her weapon, and its strange design was a form of spiritual warfare. It was a castle, but its moats were psychological, and its ramparts were built of superstition. The machine required fuel, and that fuel was money, an almost limitless, ceaseless river of it. To grasp the scale of the Winchester project, one must first grasp the scale of the Winchester fortune. When William Wirt Winchester died in 1881, he left his widow an inheritance that was, for the time, staggering. The $20 million she received is difficult to contextualize, but in modern terms, its purchasing power would be well over $500 million. And that was just the lump sum. The truly crucial element was the ongoing income. Her 50% stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company generated dividends that amounted to approximately $1,000 per day. Every single day, for the 38 years she lived in the house, a sum equivalent to a skilled craftsman's entire yearly salary flowed into her bank accounts. Day after day, week after week, year after year. The bills kept coming, but the money came faster. This financial engine is what made the perpetual construction possible. It transformed a rich woman's bizarre hobby into a localized industry. The Winchester estate became one of the largest employers in the Santa Clara Valley. A permanent crew of carpenters, plumbers, electricians, glaziers, and artisans depended on Sarah's paranoia for their livelihood. Supply chains were established to feed the house's insatiable appetite for materials. Entire forests of old-growth redwood were felled to provide the lumber for its ever-expanding frame. Train cars delivered Tiffany art glass from New York, German silver and bronze hardware for the thousands of doors, and hand-tooled wallpapers from the finest houses in Europe. She spared no expense. The parquet floors were masterworks of craftsmanship, intricate patterns of mahogany, rosewood, oak, and teak laid by hand. Custom fixtures were designed and cast. The house was a marvel of modern technology, boasting 3 elevators, including a rare horizontal hydraulic piston lift. It had its own gas manufacturing plant to power the 500 gaslight chandeliers. It had a sophisticated system of indoor plumbing and forced air heating, luxuries unheard of in most homes of the era. This is one of the project's most fascinating contradictions. The house's purpose was rooted in medieval superstition, a belief in ghosts and curses, but its construction was a showcase of cutting-edge Gilded Age innovation. It was a haunted house with electric call buttons and a modern sewer system. This collision of the primitive and the progressive speaks to the complexity of Sarah Winchester herself. She was a woman of her time, embracing modern comforts and technologies, yet her entire existence was dictated by a belief system that belonged to a much older, darker world. The money allowed her to build a world entirely of her own making, a physical reality that answered only to her own internal rules. The $1,000 a day was more than just income. It was a constant reminder of the source of her curse. Every paycheck she signed for a carpenter, every invoice she paid for a shipment of lumber, was an act of laundering that blood money, transforming the profits of death into a monument of appeasement. The house was, in a very real sense, a financial ghost, a spectral presence on the company's ledgers, an endless expense account opened in the name of fear. The men who built this house formed an invisible army, their names and stories largely lost to time, subsumed by the legend of the woman who employed them. They were the muscle and sinew that gave form to her ghostly visions. For 38 years, they were the constant presence on the estate, the one group of people who witnessed the mansion's daily mutations firsthand. What must it have been like to work there? To arrive each morning at a site where the previous day's work might be slated for demolition, where logic was a liability and the only constant was change. They were skilled craftsmen, trained in a tradition of order, symmetry, and purpose. Yet their primary task was to execute a design philosophy based on chaos and superstition. They built perfectly good staircases that ascended to nowhere. They framed windows in walls that would immediately be covered by another room. They were instruments of a will they could not comprehend. Yet, the pay was excellent, and in an era of precarious employment, the Winchester job was a rock of stability. As long as the old woman in the black veil kept breathing, the work would continue. There was a strict, almost feudal dynamic on the property. This was the ultimate upstairs/downstairs environment, but with a supernatural twist. Upstairs was Sarah Winchester, a spectral figure who was rarely seen. She would communicate her orders through her foreman, a buffer between her cloistered world and the noisy reality of the construction site. She was a ghost in her own machine, an unseen force directing their hands. The downstairs was the army of workers, a collective entity known only for its labor. They were the machine's cogs, essential but interchangeable. They saw the house not as a haunted sanctuary, but as a source of income, a puzzle they were paid to assemble, not to solve. They must have traded stories and rumors in the local taverns, speculating on the motives of their mysterious benefactor. Was she mad? Was she a spiritualist? Was she simply an eccentric rich woman with more money than sense? The truth was likely irrelevant to them. They were participants in a grand, strange piece of theater, and their role was to build the set. Their proximity to the project did not grant them insight. It only deepened the mystery. They inhabited the house for 12 hours a day, yet its true purpose remained as sealed to them as Sarah's private chambers. This vast gulf between the visionary and the labor is at the heart of so many great monuments. The pharaohs and their pyramids, the kings and their cathedrals, and Sarah Winchester and her labyrinth. One person's divine vision is another person's manual labor. The sweat and sawdust of the carpenters were the real foundation of the Winchester Mystery House. Their physical effort was the medium through which Sarah's abstract fear was made real. They were building a map of her psyche, but they were never allowed to see the legend that would make sense of it all. They were simply told to build another road to nowhere. The house was not just a collection of rooms. It was a self-contained universe, a hermetically sealed ecosystem designed to cater to the every need and whim of its reclusive owner. Sarah spared no expense in outfitting her fortress with the latest technological marvels, creating a stark contrast between the building's superstitious purpose and its modern infrastructure. The inclusion of 3 elevators, for instance, was a sign of both her wealth and her forward-thinking approach to convenience. One was a modern Otis electric lift, a rarity in a private home. Another was powered by a unique horizontal hydraulic piston, a custom design that allowed for a very shallow elevator car, which some speculate was for her own use as her arthritis worsened. These were not just luxuries. They were part of the labyrinth. The elevators provided another way to move unpredictably through the house, to ascend or descend without using the staircases, further confusing any spirit that might be in pursuit. The same blend of innovation and paranoia applied to the lighting and heating. The house had its own carbide gas generator, producing acetylene gas to power the hundreds of gas lights that illuminated the twisting corridors. But she was also an early adopter of electricity, and the house was wired with a push-button call system, allowing her to summon servants from anywhere in the vast structure. The heating was a state-of-the-art forced air system, but it was supplemented by 47 fireplaces, many of which were purely decorative, intended perhaps to offer a portal for spirits to enter and exit, or simply to add to the architectural confusion. The materials themselves were a testament to her refusal to compromise. She imported the finest hardwoods from around the world for her parquet floors. A single storeroom, discovered after her death, contained a fortune in unused, custom-designed art glass windows and opulent, hand-printed wallpapers. She would order these exquisite materials, have them delivered, and then, for reasons known only to herself, change her mind and seal them away, forgotten. One of the most famous examples is the magnificent ballroom, built at a cost of over $9,000, a fortune at the time. It was constructed almost entirely without nails, using a complex system of joints and screws. Its walls are paneled in different woods, its acoustics are nearly perfect, but it was almost certainly never used for a ball. It existed as a monument to what could be, a grand gesture to spirits who may or may not have appreciated the fine craftsmanship. The house became a museum of its own construction, a repository of beautiful, useless things. It was a physical manifestation of conspicuous consumption, but the consumption was not for social display. It was a private offering, a sacrifice of wealth on the altar of fear. Every Tiffany window boarded up, every roll of expensive wallpaper sealed in a storeroom, was another prayer, another piece of her fortune offered up to the ghosts in exchange for her life. The house was a hungry god, and Sarah Winchester was its sole, devoted worshiper, feeding it a constant diet of money, materials, and fear. Life within the ever-expanding walls of the Winchester mansion settled into a strange and rigid routine, a private liturgy known only to Sarah and her small, cloistered staff. Her days were governed not by the sun, but by a private, internal clock of ritual and superstition. At the heart of her daily practice was the number 13. Her custom-made dinner plates had 13 stars. Her will was divided into 13 parts and she signed it 13 times. This numerical obsession was the scaffolding upon which she built her daily existence. But the most important time of day was the dead of night. Every evening at midnight, a bell in a tower at the center of the house would toll, its sound echoing over the darkened orchards. This was the signal for the spirits. Shortly after, another bell would ring, this one a signal for her servants to know that the nightly séance had begun. Sarah would then make her way through the dark, confusing hallways to the blue room. Her movements through the house were intentionally erratic. She rarely slept in the same bedroom 2 nights in a row, a tactic to elude any malevolent spirits that might have found their way inside. With 40 bedrooms to choose from, she was a moving target in her own home. Her niece, Marion Marriott, lived with her for many years, acting as a companion, a secretary, and a fragile bridge to the outside world. Marion was the enabler, the one who normalized the madness. She managed the household accounts, dealt with the foreman, and provided a semblance of family life in an environment that was anything but normal. What must it have been like for her to live inside her aunt's paranoid delusion? To sit down for dinner in a mansion that groaned with the sounds of its own constant, pointless growth? She was a captive of her aunt's wealth and fear, a salaried companion in a gilded cage. Marian's presence highlights the human cost of Sarah's obsession. While Sarah was battling ghosts, Marian was battling a profound and bizarre loneliness. Her life dictated by the whims of spirits she likely did not believe in. The relationship between the two women was the quiet, emotional core of the house, a drama that played out in the shadow of the great, noisy construction project. Sarah's isolation was profound. She dressed in black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a perpetual widow not just for her husband and child, but for the life she had lost. She was a prisoner of her own design, the vastness of her house only serving to amplify her solitude. The thousands of doors and windows were not openings to the world, but barriers against it. She had built an entire universe for herself, but it was a universe with a population of one. The daily rituals, the nightly bells, the constant building, they were all part of an elaborate system to keep the terror at bay. But they also created a life of profound and heartbreaking isolation, a life where the only consistent companions were the sound of hammers and the ghosts in her head. The house ceased to be an object and became an organism. It was no longer a project Sarah Winchester controlled. It was a living, breathing entity with its own needs, its own momentum, its own insatiable appetite. It grew with the slow, inexorable logic of a coral reef, each new room a calcified layer of its owner's fear. It consumed resources on an industrial scale: lumber, glass, metal, and, above all, money. Its roots were the deep water and gas lines that snaked beneath the foundation. Its circulatory system was the network of plumbing and heating ducts that ran through its walls. Its nervous system was the electric call-button network that radiated from Sarah's chambers. And its voice, its constant, inescapable voice, was the percussive symphony of saws and hammers. This personification is not just a rhetorical device. It is central to understanding the psychological trap the house had become. For Sarah, the house was her protector, her collaborator in the fight against the spirit world. It was her armor. But as it grew, its nature began to shift. The armor became a cage. The sanctuary became a prison. Its sheer size and complexity made it a burden. To maintain, it was a monumental task. To navigate, it was a daily challenge. To escape, it was impossible. The project had taken on a life of its own, its continuation a matter of existential necessity according to the psychic's prophecy. She couldn't stop building, not because she didn't want to, but because she believed she couldn't. To stop was to die. The house held her hostage. It was a predator that she herself had created, and she was required to feed it daily with new additions, new wings, new follies, lest it turn on her. The relationship was entirely symbiotic. The house needed her fortune and her fear to grow, and she needed the house's growth to feel safe. This feedback loop of paranoia and construction created a monstrous, codependent relationship between the builder and the building. We see this in the house's most illogical features. The endless, twisting hallways were not just confusing for spirits. They were confusing for anyone. The doors that opened onto nothing were not just traps for ghosts. They were a danger to the living. The structure was becoming actively hostile, a physical manifestation of the internal chaos that spawned it. The building was the silent protagonist of this story, its growth charting the progression of Sarah's state of mind. In the early years, the additions were perhaps more rational extensions of a home. But as the decades wore on, and her isolation deepened, the architecture became more frantic, more desperate. The house became a mirror, reflecting the increasingly fragmented and labyrinthine nature of her own thoughts. It was the trap, and the trap was now fully built. It had ensnared its creator so completely that there was no longer a distinction between her life and the life of the house. They would live or die together. The hammers had to keep falling, not just to keep the ghosts at bay, but to keep the very idea of a different life, a life beyond these walls, from ever taking root. For 2 decades, Sarah Winchester's fortress of superstition had held firm against the invisible forces she believed were hunting her. She had created a world that answered only to her own rules, a physical reality built to defy the spiritual one. But on the morning of April 18, 1906, an external force of unimaginable power, a force that cared nothing for curses or ghosts, asserted its dominance. At 5:12 a.m., the Great San Francisco earthquake ripped through Northern California. The shockwave, originating just miles off the coast, was one of the most powerful in recorded history, and the Santa Clara Valley was shaken with terrifying violence. Inside the sprawling, top-heavy, and structurally dubious mansion, the moment was apocalyptic. The house, which had been a symbol of Sarah's attempt to control her destiny, was now an instrument of terror. It groaned and twisted like a great beast in pain. Plaster rained down from the ceilings. The thousands of windows rattled in their frames, many of them shattering, sending shards of glass flying through the darkened rooms. The hundreds of gaslights swayed violently, their flames licking at the ornate woodwork. Chimneys collapsed, bricks tumbling down through the roof. The house's most fantastical creation, the 7-story tower at its center, was mortally wounded, twisting on its weak foundation and partially collapsing. For Sarah Winchester, who was sleeping in one of her preferred bedrooms in the front of the house, the Daisy Room, it was the moment her deepest fears were realized. The shaking was so violent that the room's door was wrenched from its frame, trapping her inside. She was alone, in the dark, surrounded by the sound of her sanctuary tearing itself apart. The protector had become the predator. The physical world was now as chaotic and terrifying as the spiritual world she had tried so hard to appease. This was the turning point. The earthquake was not a geological event to Sarah. It was a message. It was a sign of the spirit's profound anger. Her construction, her decades of appeasement, her endless financial sacrifice. It had all been for nothing. The ghosts were not placated. They had attacked her house, her armor, and very nearly taken her life. She had built a fortress against the supernatural, and it had been brought to its knees by the natural. The illusion of control was shattered as surely as the Tiffany windows. The house had failed her. It took hours for her staff to find her. They worked their way through the debris-choked hallways, calling her name, their voices swallowed by the damaged mansion. When they finally reached the Daisy Room, they had to pry the door open to free her. She emerged, shaken but physically unharmed, into the wreckage of her life's work. The sight that greeted her was one of devastation. The beautiful front sections of the house were in ruins. The grand entrance was blocked by rubble. The magnificent 7-story tower, the whimsical centerpiece of her architectural fantasy, was now a crippled wreck. Looking at the destruction, Sarah Winchester did not see a need for rebuilding. She saw an omen. The spirits were furious, and she believed she knew why. In her mind, she had spent too much time and money on the front portions of the house, the beautiful, ornate rooms that were, in her view, built more for her own vanity than for the spirits. The grand ballroom, the elegant reception rooms, these were earthly follies, and the spirits had punished her for them in the most direct way possible. Her response was immediate and decisive. She ordered the entire front section of the house, nearly 30 rooms in all, to be boarded up. They were not to be repaired. They were to be abandoned, sealed off like a tomb, a permanent monument to the spirit's wrath. The beautiful front door would never be used again. The rubble would be cleared, but the rooms would remain empty, dark, and silent, a constant reminder of her failure. This act fundamentally changed the nature of the house and the project. The dream, if there ever was one, was over. The hope that the house could be a beautiful sanctuary, a place of peace for both her and the spirits, was gone. It was now purely a cage, a labyrinth of appeasement. The construction did not stop, the prophecy was too powerful for that, but its character shifted. The work became more utilitarian, more frantic. The focus moved to the chaotic, maze-like sections at the back of the house. The building continued to grow, but it grew like a scar, a gnarled and twisted mass of wood and nails. The earthquake had inflicted a deep psychological wound on Sarah, and the house now bore the physical evidence of that trauma. The sealed-off front rooms became the mansion's unconscious mind, a place of repressed memories and abandoned hopes. The house was now divided, at war with itself, part beautiful ruin, part sprawling, active madness. The turning point was complete. The illusion of a sanctuary had been violently torn away, revealing the prison that had been there all along. The house was no longer a place she was building to live in. It was a place she was building to die in. The final 16 years of Sarah Winchester's life were spent in the shadow of the great earthquake. The world outside her sprawling, damaged estate was changing at a dizzying pace. The age of the automobile had dawned, the first airplanes were taking to the skies, and the Great War was reconfiguring the map of Europe. But inside the Winchester house, time was frozen. The construction continued, a relentless, anachronistic ritual from a bygone era. The hammers still fell, but perhaps with a little less vigor. The pace of expansion slowed, mirroring the slowing of its owner's own life force. Sarah was now an old woman, increasingly frail, her world shrinking to a few chosen rooms within the vast, dark labyrinth she had created. Her arthritis, a source of chronic pain for years, grew worse. This is likely the reason for the construction of the switchback staircase, with its tiny 2-inch risers, allowing her to ascend to the next floor without having to bend her knees significantly. It is a poignant architectural detail, a rare moment where a practical, human need seems to have momentarily overridden the supernatural blueprint. It serves as a reminder that amidst all the folklore and ghost stories, at the center of this architectural madness was a real person, an aging woman in physical and emotional pain, trying to navigate the strange world she had built for herself. The house continued to grow, but its new additions felt more like footnotes than new chapters. The grand, ambitious projects of the early years were a thing of the past. The work was now more about maintenance, about small, bewildering alterations to the existing maze. A new hallway here, a sealed-off room there. The machine was running down. Sarah herself became even more reclusive. The formidable, if eccentric, mistress of the manor became a frail, shadowy figure, rarely seen even by her most trusted servants. She was the ghost in the machine, the unseen power source that kept the whole strange enterprise lurching forward. Her vast fortune was still intact, the daily deposits still arriving like clockwork, but the will behind the project seemed to be waning. The house had become less a project of active creation and more a monument to a decision made long ago, a habit she could not break. It stood there, part ruin, part construction site, a bizarre relic of the Gilded Age, while the 20th century roared to life just beyond its cypress hedges. The sound of the hammers, once a symbol of life and defiance, now sounded more like a death watch, counting down the final years of the woman who believed that silence would be her end. On September 5, 1922, the thing Sarah Winchester had spent 38 years and a vast fortune to prevent finally happened. She died. She passed away in her sleep from heart failure, in her beloved boudoir, a room she had used consistently in her final years. She was 82 years old, and with her last breath, the engine that had driven the great Winchester project for nearly 4 decades sputtered and fell silent. The foreman gathered the crews of carpenters, the day shift and the night shift, and gave them the news. Their patron was gone. He instructed them to put down their tools. The story goes that one carpenter, in the middle of hammering a nail, simply stopped, leaving it half-driven into a plank of wood. And there it remains to this day, a small metal punctuation mark at the end of a very long and strange sentence. For the first time in 38 years, a profound and unnerving silence descended upon the Winchester estate. The ceaseless percussion, the soundtrack of the valley, the mechanical heartbeat of the house, was gone. The silence must have been deafening, not just to the workers who had known nothing else, but to the house itself. The organism's life force had been extinguished. The machine was finally, irrevocably, switched off. The house was frozen in mid-creation, an unfinished symphony of fear. Staircases led to unbuilt floors. Doorways opened into empty spaces where rooms were planned but would never be constructed. Walls stood unplastered, their lath skeletons exposed to the air. The house was now a perfect snapshot of the moment its creator's life ended. It was a monument not just to her life, but to her death. The workers packed their tools and went home, their strange, singular employment at an end. The invisible army was disbanded. The house, which had been a hive of constant activity, was now utterly still, populated only by Sarah's niece and a few remaining servants, adrift in the vast, silent labyrinth. What happens to a trap when the trapper is gone? What happens to a machine when its operator dies? The Winchester Mystery House was about to find out. It had outlived the woman who built it, the woman it was designed to protect. It was now an orphan, a vast, bewildering, and very expensive piece of property with no purpose. Its reason for being had vanished overnight, leaving behind only the strange, physical evidence of a life lived in the shadow of a terrible fear. The world was about to be introduced to Sarah Winchester's private obsession. Her will was read, a document as complex and idiosyncratic as her house. The bulk of her remaining fortune went to her favorite niece, Marion, and to various charities, including a hospital established in her husband's name to treat tuberculosis. But the house, the magnum opus of her life, was not mentioned. It was simply part of the estate's remainder, a giant, unclassifiable asset to be dealt with. The executors of her estate and a team of appraisers were the first outsiders to attempt a systematic exploration of the mansion. What they found baffled them. They opened doors to find solid walls. They followed hallways that looped back on themselves. They discovered storerooms filled with priceless, unused furnishings. They tried to count the rooms, a task that proved nearly impossible, with different teams returning with different numbers. The house resisted being catalogued, refused to be understood. The newspapers of the day, hungry for a story, descended on the property. Reporters and photographers were given tours, and the legend of the Winchester Mystery House was born. They sensationalized the story, focusing on the psychic, the ghosts, and the architectural madness. They painted Sarah as a mad, reclusive spiritualist, a caricature that has stuck to her ever since. The house, her private sanctuary of fear, was suddenly a public spectacle. Its secrets were laid bare, its private rituals turned into tabloid headlines. The inventory of the house's contents took 6 weeks of continuous work. Movers worked 8 hours a day, filling 6 moving trucks a day to empty the mansion. It was a treasure trove of Gilded Age opulence, mixed with the mundane and the bizarre. There were chests of fine silver, crates of crystal, but also entire rooms filled with nothing but screens, or sinks, or windows. The sheer volume of material possessions was overwhelming, a testament to the compulsive nature of her project. The house was sold at auction to a local investor for a paltry sum. Its value was in its land, not in the bewildering structure that sat upon it. The initial plan was likely to tear it down and develop the valuable orchard property. But the public's fascination with the story was undeniable. The new owners quickly realized that the house's true value was not in its wood and glass, but in its legend. Less than a year after Sarah's death, the house was opened to the public for tours. The private labyrinth became a tourist attraction. The fortress of fear became a roadside curiosity. The transformation was swift and total. The house that was built to hide one woman from the world was now on display for all the world to see. Its silent, lonely corridors were now filled with the footsteps and voices of strangers, their gasps of wonder and nervous laughter echoing where only Sarah's solitary prayers once resided. Today, the Winchester Mystery House stands as one of California's most famous tourist attractions, a bizarre and beloved piece of architectural folklore. The orchards that once surrounded it have been replaced by a bustling, modern city. Freeways roar nearby, and the quiet agricultural valley of Sarah's time is now the heart of Silicon Valley, a global center of technological innovation. The house is an analog anomaly in a digital world. Its strange, handcrafted madness a stark contrast to the clean, logical code of the companies that are now its neighbors. It is managed as a business, with guided tours, a gift shop selling miniature replicas and ghost-themed trinkets, and even flashlight tours on Friday the 13th. The commercialization of Sarah's story is both fascinating and unsettling. Her profound grief, her crippling guilt, and her lifelong paranoia have been packaged and sold as entertainment. The house is no longer a monument to her pain. It is a backdrop for ghost stories and Halloween events. Does this cheapen her legacy? Or does it, in a strange way, preserve it? The house has survived because it became a story, a legend that captured the public imagination. Without the ghost tours and the souvenir keychains, the structure itself would have likely been demolished a century ago, its strange memory bulldozed to make way for a shopping mall or a housing development. The tourism is the economic engine that keeps the machine alive, funding the constant, expensive maintenance required to keep the sprawling, poorly constructed mansion from falling down. This brings us to the mirror. What does our enduring fascination with this place say about us? Why do we flock to see the evidence of one woman's profound unhappiness? Perhaps it is because the house speaks to something deeply human. We all have our own ghosts, our own regrets, our own irrational fears. We all, in our own way, are constantly building structures to manage our anxieties. We may not use redwood and nails, but we build routines, habits, and belief systems to keep the chaos at bay. The Winchester house is simply a more literal, more extravagant version of this universal human impulse. We tour its halls and we feel a strange sense of recognition. We see the staircase to the ceiling and we understand, on some intuitive level, what it means to build a path with no destination. We see the door that opens onto a 3-story drop and we understand the concept of a self-made trap. The house is a mirror reflecting our own internal labyrinths, our own attempts to build our way out of pain. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, the burden of inherited guilt, and the profound loneliness that can accompany great wealth. But it is also a story of resilience, of one woman's bizarre but determined attempt to survive an unsurvivable loss. We return to the house as the day ends, as the last tour group departs and the California twilight begins to bleed across the sky. The light is soft now, forgiving. It smooths the hard, jagged edges of the roofline, lending a melancholic beauty to the architectural chaos. The silence has returned, a silence deeper now because it is no longer punctuated by the memory of hammers. The house is alone again with its secrets. Was Sarah Winchester truly haunted by the spirits of those killed by her family's rifle? Was she a prophet, a woman attuned to a spiritual reality we cannot see? Or was she simply a woman broken by grief, suffering from a profound form of post-traumatic stress, who found a strange and creative way to cope? The answer ultimately is irrelevant. The house is the proof of her belief. It is a testament, built at enormous expense, to the power of a story. She inherited a fortune made from a narrative of violent expansion, the myth of the American West, and she spent it creating a counter-narrative, a story of apology and appeasement. The house is not just a building. It is a 160-room argument against the legacy she was born into. It is an attempt to use the tools of the material world to solve a spiritual crisis. And in that, it is a profoundly human endeavor. It is a monument to the things we build to quiet the voices in our heads. It stands as a physical map of a tormented soul, a sprawling, wooden confession. It teaches us that a legacy, like a house, can be a sanctuary or a prison, and that sometimes it can be both at the same time. The structure she left behind is not just a mystery of architecture, but a mystery of the human heart, a place that asks us to consider the ghosts we all carry, the price of our own fortunes, and the bewildering blueprints we follow in the desperate, hopeful, and often irrational project of building a life.